Bruno lay curled in the corner of his kennel, his thick fur matted and dull. The concrete beneath him was cold, and the air carried the scent of countless other forgotten dogs, some barking in desperation, others silent in surrender. But Bruno was different. He had once known love, warmth, and a place to call home. Now all he had was this cage. The shelter had been his home for weeks, but no one had come for him. Day after day, people walked past his kennel without a second glance. They always seemed to prefer the younger, more energetic dogs, the ones who wagged their tails and pressed their noses against the bars. But Bruno had learned that hope only led to heartbreak. Each time someone lingered near his kennel, he had dared to believe they would choose him. Each time, they walked away. But tonight felt different. Bruno sensed something was wrong. He had heard the whispers among the staff, seen the solemn looks they exchanged when they passed his kennel. He didn't understand every word, but he understood enough. His time was almost up. As the shelter lights dimmed for the night, a deep sadness settled over him. He lifted his head and let out a long, mournful cry. It wasn't just a whimper or a bark. It was the sound of pure despair, of a soul begging for one last chance. The sound echoed through the empty halls, carrying with it the weight of every abandoned animal that had ever waited for a home that never came. Emily, a young shelter volunteer, was locking up when she heard it. She had worked at the shelter for years and thought she had grown used to the sorrow that filled these walls. But something about Bruno's cry made her stop in her tracks. It wasn't just sadness, it was a plea. Her heart clenched as she turned toward his kennel. There he was, his deep brown eyes locked onto hers, silently begging for mercy. She knelt beside the bars, reaching a hand through to touch his fur. He didn't pull away. Instead, he pressed his head against her fingers, desperate for any ounce of comfort. "I'm so sorry, buddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She knew what tomorrow would bring. She had seen it too many times before. The thought of Bruno being led down that hallway, never to return, made her chest tighten. She had to do something. Pulling out her phone, she snapped a quick photo of him, his face half hidden in the shadows, his eyes filled with silent pain. Without overthinking, she typed out a message and posted it online. "This sweet boy has hours left. He deserves a second chance. Can anyone help?" She stared at the screen for a moment, her fingers trembling. Would anyone even see it in time? Would anyone care? With a heavy sigh, she tucked her phone into her pocket and gave Bruno one last pat before heading for the door. As she walked away, Bruno let out another cry, softer this time, a final plea to the universe. And somewhere out there, the universe was listening. Emily sat in her car, staring at the dimly lit road ahead. The shelter parking lot was empty, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But inside her mind, all she could hear was Bruno's heartbreaking cry. She had seen countless dogs come and go, but something about Bruno felt different. Maybe it was the way he didn't bark like the others, the way his deep brown eyes held a sadness that ran deeper than just being abandoned. It was as if he understood what was coming and had already given up. She sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. She had done what she could. She had posted his picture, pleaded for help. But deep down, she knew the truth. Late-night social media posts rarely worked miracles. Most people scrolling through their feeds wouldn't stop for another shelter dog. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to try something more. With a deep breath, she picked up her phone and started typing furiously. She sent messages to rescue groups, tagged local animal lovers, and even reached out to a few past adopters who had taken in difficult cases before. "Please, if you know anyone who can take in a German Shepherd, time is running out." Her hands were shaking as she hit send. She had never felt so helpless before. Inside the shelter, Bruno lay in his kennel, his head resting on his paws. The other dogs had finally settled for the night, their restless movements slowing into uneasy sleep. But Bruno couldn't sleep. His ears twitched at every small noise, his body tense with an unshakable feeling of dread. He wasn't always like this. Once he had a home, a backyard to run in, a warm bed to sleep on, a family that loved him. He used to chase tennis balls in the sun and curl up at his owner's feet after a long day. But all of that was gone now, replaced by cold concrete and metal bars. He let out a soft whimper, barely audible, as if he were afraid to disturb the silence. Then, outside in the darkness, a phone buzzed. Emily, who had almost given up hope, glanced down at her screen. A notification flashed across it. New message from unknown number. Her heart pounded as she opened it. I saw your post. Tell me about the dog. I think I can help. She sat up straight, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. She quickly typed back, fingers moving fast. His name is Bruno. He's a German shepherd, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Loyal, smart, but he's running out of time. He needs a miracle. Seconds felt like hours as she waited for a reply. Then, another message came through. I lost my German shepherd last year. Been thinking about adopting again. How much time do I have? Emily's breath hitched. Could this really be happening? She quickly responded. Less than 12 hours. A pause. Then finally, I'm on my way. Emily's hands trembled as she read the words over and over again. Could this be real? Could Bruno's story take a turn for the better at the very last moment? She didn't know. But for the first time that night, she allowed herself to hope. Emily's heart raced as she read the words on her screen again. I'm on my way. She barely knew this person. There was no name, no details, just a simple promise. But in the world of animal rescue, hope came in the smallest of forms. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It was nearly midnight. The shelter would reopen in the morning, and by noon, Bruno would be led down that lonely hallway. She had seen it happen too many times. She had tried to save others before, but last-minute miracles were rare. She took a deep breath and texted back. How soon can you get here? The reply came almost instantly. I live a few hours away. I'll leave now. Please, don't let them take him before I get there. Emily's pulse quickened. A few hours? That was cutting it close. Too close. But it was something. She had to make sure Bruno was still there when the stranger arrived. Shoving her phone into her pocket, she turned the key in the ignition, but then she hesitated. Should she just go home and wait? Sleep wasn't an option now, not with the possibility of saving Bruno hanging in balance. Instead, she made a decision. She threw the car into reverse, pulled out of the parking lot, and headed straight to the one place that could make a difference, the home of the shelter director. Inside the shelter, Bruno lay still, his ears twitching at the faint sounds of the night. Most of the other dogs had fallen into uneasy sleep, their soft whimpers filling the quiet space. Bruno, however, stayed awake. He didn't know why, but something inside him told him this night was different. He lifted his head slightly when he heard the distant sound of a car driving away. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel completely alone. Emily parked in front of the small, dark house and took a deep breath. The shelter director, Mark, wasn't the type to break the rules. He was kind, but he followed procedures to the letter. Convincing him to hold Bruno for a little longer wouldn't be easy. Still, she had to try. She knocked on the door, shifting nervously on her feet. A few moments later, a light flickered on inside. Then the door creaked open. Mark squinted at her, clearly confused, and not pleased to be woken up. Emily, what are you doing here? She swallowed hard. I need a favor. A big one. He sighed, rubbing his eyes. Is this about a dog? Yes, she said, her voice firm. It's Bruno. Mark's expression softened slightly, but he shook his head. Emily, you know how this works. We have too many dogs. We can't keep them all. I know, she said quickly, but someone is coming for him. They saw my post. They're driving here right now to adopt him. All I need is time. Mark let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. How much time? She hesitated. A few hours. He frowned. Emily. Please, she whispered. Just this once. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, finally, he exhaled and muttered, fine. But if they're not here by morning, I can't do anything. Emily felt tears of relief sting her eyes. Thank you. As she drove back to the shelter, she glanced at her phone one more time. The stranger's last message still lingered on her screen. I'm coming. Just hold on. Bruno's fate now rested in the hands of someone neither of them had ever met. Morning arrived too soon. The shelter doors would open in less than an hour, and Bruno had no idea how close he was to the end of his story or the beginning of a new one. Emily paced outside the shelter, gripping her phone tightly. She had barely slept, constantly checking for updates from the mysterious stranger who had promised to come for Bruno. So far, there had been no new messages. What if they changed their mind? She forced the thought away, glancing toward the shelter entrance. Mark, the director, was already inside, preparing for the day. She had managed to buy Bruno a little more time, but it wasn't much. Once the euthanasia list was processed, it would be too late. Her phone buzzed. She fumbled to unlock it, hope surging inside her, only to see a weather alert. A storm was moving in, bringing heavy rain and strong winds. She groaned in frustration. This was the last thing she needed. She quickly sent a message. "Are you close?" Minutes passed with no response. Inside the shelter, Bruno sat quietly in his kennel, watching as staff members walked past. He didn't know why, but something about today felt different. There was an energy in the air, one that made his ears perk up just a little higher. Then he heard the familiar sound of jingling keys, the same sound he had heard too many times before. A staff member stopped in front of his kennel, clipboard in hand. "All right, big guy," the man sighed. "Let's go." Bruno didn't move. His instincts told him something was coming. Something was about to change. But he didn't have the luxury of time. The worker opened the kennel door, clipping a leash onto Bruno's collar. For a moment, the German shepherd resisted, his paws digging into the concrete. "Come on, buddy," the worker said gently, giving the leash a small tug. "It's time." Emily rushed inside, her heart pounding. "Wait," she called out, nearly colliding with Mark as she ran down the hall. The shelter director turned to her with a sigh. "Emily, we've already delayed this once." "I know," she said breathlessly. "But they're coming. The person who wants him is coming." Mark frowned. "Are you sure? Have they checked in?" Emily hesitated. She hadn't received a response in over an hour, but she couldn't give up now. "Yes," she lied. "They're on their way." Mark studied her for a long moment before finally sighing. "1 hour," he said firmly. "That's all I can give you." Emily nodded, turning back to Bruno. The worker had stopped, waiting for the final call. She knelt beside the dog, running a hand over his thick fur. "Hold on, buddy," she whispered. "Someone is coming for you." Bruno looked up at her with quiet understanding. And somewhere, out on the road, the mysterious stranger was racing against time to prove her right. The sky had darkened with thick, gray clouds, and the wind howled through the trees as the storm rolled in. The shelter's fluorescent lights flickered slightly as the rumble of distant thunder echoed across the empty parking lot. Emily stood at the front desk, her heart pounding as she checked her phone again. No messages, no calls. Time was running out. Mark glanced at the clock on the wall. 5 more minutes, Emily, he warned. "I can't hold off any longer." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her phone. She had promised Bruno someone was coming. Had she been wrong? Had she given him false hope? Then, just as Mark turned to give the final order, the front door flew open. A gust of wind and rain swept inside as a tall man rushed in, breathless and dripping wet. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his clothes were soaked from the storm. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the urgency in his eyes. "Where is he?" the man asked, his voice rough from the cold and the exhaustion of a long drive. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "You made it." Mark raised an eyebrow. "And you are." The man wiped the rain from his face, trying to catch his breath. "Jake," he said, "I saw the post. I drove all night. I'm here for Bruno." Emily's relief was so overwhelming that she nearly laughed. Instead, she turned and ran down the hallway. "Come with me." Jake followed, his wet shoes squeaking against the floor as they hurried past rows of kennels. Bruno was still sitting in his cage, his ears drooping as if he had already accepted his fate. But when Emily and Jake skidded to a stop in front of him, something changed. Bruno lifted his head. His tired brown eyes locked onto Jake's. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was as if the world had frozen around them. Jake slowly crouched down, reaching a hand toward the bars. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "I'm here." Bruno didn't bark. He didn't cower. Instead, he got to his feet and took a slow step forward, then another. Then, without hesitation, he pressed his head against the bars, letting out a soft, shuddering sigh. Jake's hand trembled as he ran it through the dog's thick fur. His voice cracked as he whispered, "You remind me so much of him." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't need to ask who Ben was. She knew. This wasn't just about saving a dog. This was about healing a heart that had been broken before. Mark, watching from the doorway, let out a quiet sigh. "Well," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Looks like we've got an adoption to process." For the first time in weeks, Bruno's tail wagged. He was finally going home. Bruno sat quietly as Jake filled out the adoption paperwork, his deep brown eyes watching the man's every move. He wasn't wagging his tail in excitement, nor was he trembling in fear. It was as if he was waiting to see if this was real, if this moment would last. Emily stood nearby, her heart still racing from everything that had happened. She had witnessed plenty of adoptions before, but none had felt quite like this. There was something unspoken between Jake and Bruno, something that went beyond a simple rescue. As Jake signed the final form, Mark gave a small nod. "That's it," he said. "He's officially yours." Jake exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes before looking down at the dog sitting patiently beside him. "You hear that, buddy? You're coming home." Bruno didn't jump up or bark in excitement. Instead, he leaned against Jake's leg, pressing his weight into him as if silently saying, "Thank you." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "I can't believe you made it in time." Jake let out a small, tired chuckle. "Honestly, neither can I." He looked down at Bruno, his expression softening. "I lost my German Shepherd Max last year. He was my best friend. After he was gone, I told myself I wasn't ready for another dog." Emily nodded, understanding the pain behind his words. Losing a pet wasn't just losing an animal. It was losing a part of your heart. Jake sighed. "But when I saw your post last night, something just told me I had to come. I don't know why, but I couldn't ignore it." He ran a hand through Bruno's thick fur. "And now, looking at him, I know why." Bruno gazed up at Jake, his deep eyes filled with something Emily hadn't seen before. Trust. Mark cleared his throat. "All right, before I start crying like one of those adoption commercials, let's get you two out of here." He handed Jake a leash. "Take care of him." Jake clipped the leash onto Bruno's collar and gave it a gentle tug. "Come on, big guy." For a second, Bruno hesitated. He glanced back at Emily, the girl who had fought for him when no one else would. She knelt down and stroked his face. "You're going to be okay now," she whispered. Bruno let out a soft huff, as if he understood. Then, without looking back again, he followed Jake toward the door. As they stepped outside, the storm had passed. The sky was still cloudy, but a soft glow of morning light peeked through, casting a golden hue over the wet pavement. Jake opened the passenger door of his truck. "Come on, buddy." Bruno hesitated for only a moment before jumping in. As Jake slid into the driver's seat, he glanced over at the dog beside him and smiled. "Let's go home." For the first time in weeks, Bruno finally believed in that word again. Home. The truck rumbled down the highway, the windshield wipers swishing rhythmically against the fading drizzle. Bruno sat in the passenger seat, his large body curled up on the seat, but his eyes never leaving Jake. He wasn't sure what was happening yet, but something deep inside told him that this was different. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. Jake glanced at him with a small smile. "You're a quiet one, huh?" he murmured. "Max used to talk back whenever I said something. Always had something to say." Bruno's ears perked slightly at the name. He didn't understand the words, but he felt the emotion behind them. Loss, grief, and something else. Hope. Jake reached over, running a hand gently over Bruno's fur. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he admitted, more to himself than to the dog. "But something tells me you are." Bruno let out a soft sigh, settling his head on Jake's leg. The storm had cleared, leaving behind damp roads and the fresh scent of rain. Jake's house was still a few hours away, but the drive felt lighter now, less like an escape and more like a new beginning. After a while, Jake pulled into a quiet rest stop. "All right, let's stretch our legs," he said as he turned off the engine. Bruno followed him out of the truck, sniffing the air cautiously. The grass was damp, the earth soft beneath his paws. Jake knelt beside him, holding the leash loosely. "This is your second chance, buddy," he said softly. "We both needed one." Bruno looked up at him, eyes filled with silent understanding. Then, for the first time since leaving the shelter, he did something unexpected. He licked Jake's hand. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, that's a start." As they got back into the truck, something in the air felt different. Bruno no longer sat stiffly in his seat. He was still cautious, still uncertain, but there was a quiet acceptance in the way he let his body relax. Jake glanced at him one more time before putting the truck into drive. "We're gonna be okay, you and me." Bruno didn't know where they were going, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what came next. The truck pulled up to a quiet house nestled among tall trees, the early morning sun casting a golden glow over the damp ground. Bruno lifted his head, sniffing the air as the engine shut off. There was something different about this place. It didn't smell like the shelter. It didn't smell like fear. It smelled like home. Jake stepped out first, stretching his stiff muscles after the long drive. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. "All right, big guy," he said gently. "Welcome home." Bruno hesitated for a moment, staring at the open door. In the past, open doors had meant bad things. They had meant being abandoned. They had meant cold, empty places where no one came back for him. But Jake was waiting. Bruno took a deep breath, then slowly stepped out, his paws touching the soft earth of his new home. Jake led him up the porch steps and pushed open the front door. The inside of the house was simple but warm, a cozy living room, a fireplace, and a large dog bed in the corner, as if it had been waiting for Bruno all along. Jake unclipped the leash, stepping back to give him space. "Go ahead. Take a look around." Bruno's ears twitched. He took a cautious step forward, sniffing the air, then another. He walked slowly through the living room, then into the kitchen, his nose leading the way. There was no cold concrete, no metal bars, no distant cries of other dogs. Just warmth, just quiet. Jake watched from a distance, giving Bruno time to adjust. "I know it's gonna take time," he said softly. "But you're safe now. No more cages. No more fear. Just us." Bruno stopped in the center of the room. He looked back at Jake, studying him carefully. Then, with a deep sigh, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He lay down, not in fear, not in defeat, but in comfort. Jake smiled. "That's right, buddy. You're home." For the first time in what felt like forever, Bruno closed his eyes, not because he was exhausted or afraid, but because, finally, he could rest. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, he knew his story wasn't over. It was just beginning.